The shutter. We have looked at the aperture and how it can be used to reduce the light entering the camera, but remember, there is the amount of time the sensor is exposed to light that also has to be taken into consideration. You are probably already familiar with what the shutter is. The clue is in the name. Like a shutter on a window, you open it to let the light in and close it to shut the light out. Sometimes, the shutter is referred to as a curtain. The term curtain will pop up now and again in your camera's menu for various settings that you don't need to know as yet. Just remember that if you see the word curtain, it refers to the shutter. The shutter has a speed, which is the time between when it opens and when it closes. A speed that you can control. Remember, we are in manual, so you control everything. That speed can be anything from a few minutes to less than 0.008 of a second and even faster, depending on the type of camera you have. In some cases, an exposure can be over several hours for various photographic effects. Let us see the full sequence of events when you press the shutter button. 1. You press the shutter button. 2. The aperture closes to the diameter, the f number, that you have set. 3. The shutter, curtain, opens, allowing the light to hit the photo sensor. 4. After a set amount of time, usually fractions of a second, the shutter closes. 5. The aperture returns to its widest setting, smallest f number. There is one more thing that happens as you press the shutter button in step 1. This is the point at which the camera focuses on whatever it is you are photographing, but we can look at this in the focusing section later. One more thing. ISO. There are 3 things that govern exposure. 2 you have now come across: light and time, controlled by the aperture and the shutter, respectively. But there is one more thing to consider, and that is something called ISO. This stands for International Organization for Standardization, but we really don't need to know that. Simply put, ISO is a setting on your camera which changes how sensitive the camera sensor is to light. To keep it simple, we are going to set the ISO to 100. You don't need to do it now, we will get there shortly. A setting of 100 is pretty much where it would be set in a normal well-lit environment, and you wouldn't give it a second thought. If you want to make your sensor more sensitive to light, then you can turn it up, from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 and beyond. In other words, if things are a bit dull, you can make your photo sensor more sensitive to the light available. You may have already set the aperture to its widest and find that to get a good exposure you will have to keep the shutter open for a length of time that could cause problems. Let's say, for example, that you need a shutter speed of 1/4 of a second to get a correct exposure. You will find that holding a camera perfectly still for 1/4 of a second is not easy, so you won't be surprised to find your photograph a bit blurred because of the camera moving in your hands. This is commonly known as camera shake and pretty much the main reason for blurred photographs. If you want to increase your shutter speed and you already know you can't make the aperture any bigger, then it makes sense to make the sensor more sensitive to light so that you can decrease the amount of time that your sensor is exposed. In other words, you will be able to use a faster shutter speed. Sounds handy for low light, doesn't it? And modern cameras have very high ISO settings. But there is a trade-off. The higher the ISO, the more noise or grainy appearance the photo will have. More modern digital cameras are better at reducing the noise for higher ISO values than older digital cameras. All will become apparent in the practical section. The exposure triangle. When it comes to exposure, we now know it is dependent on 3 things. These are the main 3 things you control independently when your camera is set to manual mode. 1. The size of the aperture. 2. The speed of the shutter. 3. The ISO setting. But, if you want to punish your brain, there is something called the exposure triangle for you to look at. It shows the relationship between all these 3 settings. Don't worry if it looks a bit complicated. The more you learn, the more sense it will make. I personally used cameras for years before even seeing this particular illustration, so it's not totally necessary, but no harm looking, and you can refer to it if need be. If it looks too confusing, just forget about it for now. More things to know. There are still quite a few things to take a look at before we start taking photographs, and they are: 1. More about the settings for shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. 2. Focusing, basic focusing. 3. White balance, sounds scarier than it is. We will look at focusing and white balance a bit later. For now we are going to look at the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO and how they are represented on the camera screens. Please don't forget to subscribe.